What I wanted to do today was I've got about half an hour and I'm looking to cover 4 broad topic areas. Firstly, to describe why does this life stage matter? Like I need to tell anyone in this audience why this life stage matters. But actually, we do have to keep reminding ourselves about why this period is really important. Not necessarily for people in this room, although I think that's important too, but certainly for people outside who sometimes don't quite get the issues around children, young people and families. I wanted to give a brief tour of the current state of our children's health and well-being, covering some key points. I won't be able to cover everything in the time available, but just highlighting some key points. And there's some really good news stories in there as well, and I want to celebrate that with you, because you're part of that achievement. I then wanted to look at what more can we do. What more can you do? What more can we do as a public health body at a national level, and working with key stakeholders, including government. And then just briefly to set out some of the support that you can expect from us as a public health agency. We're a year old next week. I was going to put a picture of a cake up there, but I thought it was a bit premature. So why does this matter? I've just picked out 4 figures, really, 4 numbers. I could have picked out dozens of numbers to highlight this. There are approximately 1,900 children born every day in England. That's a significant number of children. 12.8 million under 19s at the moment, and that's going to be rising to 13.6 million by 2020. And some people say that that's probably a conservative estimate. The under 19s population accounts for around approximately 1 in 4 of the population in England. But depending on where you live, that can rise to around a third because of the demographics. So we're talking about significant numbers and significant proportions of local residents. The other key fact that I've got up here is one that's quite sad, really, and that's the fact that 1 in 5 of under 16-year-olds live in poverty. The figure's actually much higher when we consider those who live on the edge of poverty, who are just scraping by above that threshold. And as you know, the Commission into Child Poverty is reviewing the way that it should be done by government and others to attack that figure. That's quite a tragic figure, and we know, as we'll see through the next slides, the impact that poverty has, the huge determinant it has on a child's health and well-being. So why does this matter from the evidence? Well, we know from Professor Marmot's work that investing in the early years is investing in the future. It's good for the child, it's good for the family at that point in time, but it's also good in terms of extending their life opportunities and chances. We've heard a lot about the early years and the importance of the early years, and we treasure that, and we will continue to work with agencies up and down the country in investing in early years. But we're really keen as well to stress the importance across the life course of a child, right through to 19. And in fact, Public Health England will be shortly publishing a paper at the end of April, early May, on adolescent health, young people's health, and we're proposing, in line with the Chief Medical Officer's report, that we stop seeing children ending at 18 and actually we go up to 24. But we see that age period because of the science that we know around brain development, psychological development, physical development, social aspects. Many of you will have read reports in The Guardian earlier this week showing that more and more children are staying at home for longer and longer. Bless them. We can never get rid of them, can we? Sorry, personal things now. That in all seriousness, that's delaying independence for many children, a significant issue. So the period of adolescence is really important. And as I say there, it's second only to infancy in terms of radical personal development. And the evidence shows consistently that we can make a difference where we intervene early through both universal measures and targeted. And I suspect virtually everyone in this room is involved with one or both of those types of interventions. And why does this matter for society? Well, the first point that I've got up here is actually from the Child Poverty Commission. And they're concerned, they've expressed a concern last year, that this could be the first generation for dozens of years, decades, that could actually do worse than their parents. That's quite a shocking and sobering fact. And many of us will have personal experience of that in our lives, in our professional lives. That's something that's a cause for concern for all of us. We've heard and we've seen evidence to show that investing in the early years and throughout the life course yields savings further downstream. I've not had time to put figures together to demonstrate figures to you, but there's certainly plenty of evidence to show investing, for example, in the early years can yield improvements in child development, child health and well-being further downstream, both in the period of 0 to 19, 0 to 24, but also in adult life. And we've got quite a graphic example of that in a moment. And we know that many of the poor outcomes for adults actually originate in this period during adolescence and young adulthood. And 5 of the 10 key poor health outcomes for adults actually stem from this age period. This is one example to demonstrate this. Many of you will be familiar with the work in Atlanta from the Adverse Childhood Experiences, the ACE studies. I'm really pleased to see that in Blackburn with Darwin and parts of Lancashire, they've also been carrying out ACE studies. And basically what they've done is surveyed very large numbers of the local population to identify some of the key factors for them during their childhood. And they've identified a menu of adverse childhood experiences, so some fairly obvious ones around child abuse, physical abuse and neglect, poverty, but also things like harsh parenting, unkind words and so on. And it's very interesting that when they've carried out this review, identified where the adult is today in terms of their health and well-being outcomes, and then traced back through interviews and studies the experiences that they had in childhood. What they find is that those people with a certain number of adverse childhood experiences are far more likely to suffer significant poorer health as adults. And the figures are quite alarming. So we've got here, for example, the chances of having a sexually transmitted infection are 30 times greater than the group of adults who haven't had adverse childhood experiences. 30 times greater. And that's just one example, and there are plenty of others listed there. So the evidence is mounting very powerfully that if we can intervene early during this period, we're helping individuals during that age period, particularly around education, health and well-being, but actually we're protecting society for the future. And I think the studies that we've seen from Blackburn and Darwin and other places are irrefutable proof that investing in this period is absolutely essential. So I just want to very quickly highlight some key health and well-being outcomes statistics here. So just starting off with maternity and the early years, we've got some really positive trends here. We've seen a fall in the numbers of women who are smoking at the time of pregnancy by a percentage point, and we've got an ambition to drive that down to at least 11%. And why is this important? Well, we know that smoking during pregnancy is poor for the unborn child. We know it's more likely to lead to lower weight babies, and we know that in some cases as well that it can lead to increased risk of stillbirths. We estimate as a public health body that if we can encourage more women to stop smoking during pregnancy and to increase fetal growth monitoring during that period, both by the expectant mother and by health professionals, we estimate that we could save at least 200 infant stillbirths a year, at least 200. We've seen an increase in breastfeeding prevalence over the last few years, and that's moving up slowly. And again, we all know the importance of breastfeeding, both in terms of attachment, but also the nutrients that an infant will derive from breast milk. And we can see that the numbers of children who are receiving their second dose of MMR is rising slowly and steadily, although we have got pockets in the country where the figures are significantly lower than that. Our aim has to be around 90% to meet World Health Organization standards, but we're moving in that direction. Trends for secondary school pupils on the whole is quite positive. We don't often hear these sorts of stories, do we? So we can see that smoking is now at its lowest level for many years in terms of numbers of children who say that they smoke or smoked at least once. And the numbers of children who say that they smoke regularly each week is dropping as well. So the public health messages that we're spreading, the work that you're doing it in schools and with families, is having an impact. I think it's really important that we remind ourselves of that. I know, when you're dealing with tough caseloads and large caseloads, sometimes we miss the importance of the work that we do. And this is the importance of the work that you're doing at the moment. It's driving down some of the key poor health outcomes for children currently and in future years. We know if we can delay young people from smoking, we delay them smoking into adulthood. And then if they do pick up smoking later on in adulthood, they're more likely and more able to quit. So delaying these types of behaviours during childhood and adolescence is really important. And we see similar figures around the numbers of children who are drinking alcohol. This figure's a bit tricky, really, because whilst the numbers who say that they drink is falling, and the numbers who say that they drink regularly is falling, it seems that we've got some studies that appear to be suggesting that there's a hardcore of young people who are drinking to excessive limits, and that group isn't shifting in terms of numbers. And that's an area that we obviously need to push some focus on. And we've seen a consistent decline in drug use. So I was meeting with a group of young people last week. We had a Dragon's Den type event with them, and they were challenging us about some of the work that we're doing as Public Health England. God, they were a tough crowd to please, I tell you. Anyway, they were really good, really positive. But one of the issues that came up was around drugs, because we showed this figure to them, and they looked at us and said, oh yeah, fine. And so we asked them about cannabis, and it was really interesting. It's a really articulate group of 12 to 16-year-olds. And most of them didn't see cannabis as a drug. It was just something that was casual, something social, and didn't understand the issues around psychotic episodes and so on for some groups of young people, and so on. So it's just really interesting about what young people are defining as drugs, and a challenge for us. So we see all the some positives around smoking, drinking and drug use, and a really positive success story around teenage conception. And we can see the figure going down steadily from the base year, and around 40% fall from the base year. And this is because of the investment that obviously we've seen over the years, but it's also because of a much more targeted approach, not just providing free condoms and free sexual advice to children and young people, but also getting out there. The role of school health services, independent services like Brook and youth services, all playing their part. This hasn't been the victory of a single agency or a single profession. This is multi-agency working at its most effective. And some other interesting figures from ONS showing pupil well-being. And this is quite interesting because a lot of these stories, again, we don't hear in the press. So how many of us, for example, would expect that 73% of children would say that they sit down for a meal with their family at least three times a week? I wouldn't have said that. That 82% were relatively satisfied with their school. 82%, I think that's quite high. Obviously, we'd like to see that higher. But, school's a tough time, particularly in the current climate in terms of academic rigour and pressures. So I think 82% is a fantastic figure. But there are figures there that there are some concern, and this probably will echo and resonate with a number of you. So, for example, 66% reported low anxiety yesterday, the day that they were interviewed. 66%. That suggests that just over a third of young people do have anxiety, and we know that if it's left untreated, unsupported, that can spill into something far more serious, like around self-harm, for example. But overall, some really positive numbers here. The but, and you would expect me to say but, is that this hides those young people who aren't at school. This hides those who aren't at school for a whole range of reasons, either personal preference, they've been excluded, or family circumstances. So one of our concerns is that we need to be able to understand much more carefully the profiles, the demographics of those young people, because we know they will be the most vulnerable and will experience the worst health outcomes in later life. And inequalities and variation are the kind of enemies of what we're trying to achieve, things that you face on a daily basis in your work. I've just highlighted a small number of examples of inequalities. One of the most apparent ones and obvious ones is around looked after children. Around 67,000 looked after children in England at any one point in time. And we know that for the vast majority, a significant proportion of them, health outcomes are poor, whether we were looking at oral health, sexual health, safety, and mental health, and some figures here to highlight that. We know who these young people are, and we would argue that there needs to be a much greater concerted effort to provide support for this very vulnerable group of young people, because we know that some of their life chances are mapped out during this phase. It's an absolutely critical point for us to intervene. And we see the impact of long-term conditions and illness on young people here as well. And again, this is young people expressing concerns about life chances and opportunities. but we can also see poor health outcomes around oral health and mental health as well. One of the big issues for us as a public health body is the impact of social inequality as a result of poverty and unequal economic circumstances. And we can see this quite graphically here. I could have picked any number of graphs on any number of topics. So we can see here on the left-hand side, these are non-elective admissions as a result of injury, poisoning and external events. And I've picked on boys because the figure's obviously much greater, so that it's easier to represent on the graph. And we can see the top line is those boys from most deprived backgrounds, and the line at the bottom is from those from the least deprived backgrounds. So if we start on the left, at the age of 10, we can see that there is a gap, a significant gap. But as they get older, we can see that that gap generally broadens and widens. And we know that there are consequences to that later on into young adulthood, around crime and disorder and so on. So this is a consequence of an individual family circumstance. And we know again that through targeted work, and many of you will be involved in this, that we can drive that gap down. We have an obligation to do that. The other enemy for us is the issue of variation. So even when we compare like with like authorities, similar demographics, similar age profiles, minority profiles and poverty levels and so on, we find significant variations. I've picked out 3 at random here to represent 3 different stages of the life course for children and young people. So infant mortality is the top one there. The England best is 1.3 per live 1,000 births, and the worst is in England is 7.7. That's a factor of around sixfold difference depending on where you live. It's completely shocking. And then we find that similarly for oral health, decayed, missing and filled teeth. A really significant issue for many of our children. It's the single largest cause for general anaesthetics in hospitals for children, having your teeth pulled out. And we know that we can prevent that. We can prevent that through, a whole range of programs. We have to be doing more around this. And we can see significant variation across England. So the best in England is 12.5% of children have decayed or missing teeth by the age of 5, rising to 53%, more than 4-fold difference. And if I compare, this is across England, obviously. So we're comparing very different demographic areas. But we know that if we pick very similar authorities, we will find significant differences as well. And lastly, those who are killed or seriously injured on our roads. A major public health issue because we know of the level of preventability for these deaths and injuries, the lifelong consequences for permanent injury, and obviously the tragedy around deaths. England has a great reputation across the developed world around the numbers of children who are killed or seriously injured on our roads. The figure keeps going down. The latest figures published last year show a continued drop, but we know we can do much more, and a lot of this is down to speed, driver awareness and road safety.